Kilayim Perek Mishnah Aleph. Hamavrech es hagefen ba'aretz. One way of growing new grapevines is through a method known as layering, havrocha. This is done by burying a branch of an existing grapevine in the ground and bringing it back up from the ground some distance away. This branch eventually becomes a new vine. The Mishnah discusses planting other species above the buried branch. Hamavrech es hagefen ba'aretz. If a person layered a grapevine in the ground, im ein offer hal gaba shleisha tvachim, the halacha is if there's not at least 3 tvachim of earth on top of the branch, lo yovi zera aleha, he may not plant any other seeds directly above it, because the roots of the new plant are likely to penetrate through the buried branch. This will result in the forbidden grafting of the other species onto the grapevine. As we mentioned in the first parak, Mishnah Zayin. However, we have this concern only with regard to a grapevine, since its branches are soft and it can be penetrated by the roots. Branches of other trees are thicker and harder, and a seed of another species may be planted above the buried branch. Our Mishnah is speaking of planting other species more than 6 tvachim from the trunk of the original vine. Within 6 tvachim of the vine, it's also to plant another species in any case, as is mentioned in Parak Vav. So, afilu havricha bedlas besidline. This is usher even if he layered the branch through a gourd or a pipe. A gourd whose seeds were removed is similar in form to a hollow pipe. The Mishnah is speaking of a gourd that's dried out. Otherwise, even if there's no vine there, it would be considered forbidden grafting when the roots of the other species go into the gourd. So we're talking about a dried out gourd or a pipe that's enclosed the branch in a gourd or a pipe. As long as there are less than 3 tvachim of earth above the branch, the roots may go through the gourd or pipe and into the buried branch of the vine. We have this concern only if the pipe is made of pottery. A metal pipe, however, will prevent the roots from reaching the branch. If he layered the branch through a rock, even if there are only 3 finger breadths of earth on top of it, it's still mutter to plant another min of zroim directly above it. If the branch is enclosed in solid rock, which cannot be penetrated by the roots of another plant, it's mutter to plant another species above the branch. Soft rocks, however, can be penetrated by the roots. It is not necessary for there to be 3 tvachim of earth between the other seed and the branch. Even if the branch is only 3 etzbois beneath the surface of the ground, planting above it is mutter. In actuality, it's not even necessary to have 3 etzbois between the other species on the vine. However, anything less than that would not be suitable for planting. If there's a knee in a grapevine, when planting in the area of a grapevine, the new plant must be distant 6 tvachim from the vine. That's kedei avedosa, as we saw in Parak Vav. The Mishnah discusses a vine that bends sideways and continues along the ground before turning upwards. So if there's an arkuva shebegefen, if there's a knee in a grapevine, a vine grows in a knee-shaped manner. When it comes up from the ground, it first bends sideways and continues along the ground. Then it turns and rises upward the shape of a bent knee. So, ein moeded in la element ha'ikar hasheni. We measure only from the second trunk, not the original trunk of the vine, that is where it first came up out of the ground. We consider this the point where it begins its second rise, the second trunk, to be the base of the vine. Meaning, it comes out of the ground, that's the first trunk, and then it bends, and then when it bends again and grows upwards, that's the second trunk. That's going to be the base of the vine. The 6 tvachim are therefore measured from that point rather from the point where it first came up from the ground. However, this is true only if the trunk of the vine, that is where it first came up out of the ground, is not visible, so that the second rise appears to be the spot where the vine was planted. If the original trunk of the vine is visible and recognizable as the place where the vine was planted, the 6 tvachim are measured from the original trunk. Mishnah Beis. Hamavrech shleisha gfanim ve'ikreim nirim. The halacha is that grain and various types of greens may not be planted within 6 tvachim of a grapevine. Moreover, when a group of vines are arranged in a certain manner, they are considered a vineyard, and those other minim must be kept yet further away, a distance of daled amas. One of the conditions required for vines to combine to form a vineyard is that there must be at least 2 rows of vines that are from 4 to 8 amas apart. The Mishnah is going to discuss how this law applies to layered grapevines. So, regarding the case of a person who layers the branches of a row of 3 grapevines, thus creating a second row of vines, and the trunks of the first row are visible, although the branches of the original vines are buried under the ground, the trunks of the vines remain visible. Rabbi Elazar Bat Tzadok says, if there's a distance of 4 to 8 amas between the rows, they combine to form a vineyard, even though the new vines are still connected to the parent vine and are drawing nourishment from their roots. They are considered a second independent row. The 2 rows thus combine to form a vineyard, from which other mina must be distanced 4 amas. In actuality, they would be considered a vineyard even if only 2 of the 3 vines were layered, since they have the minimum arrangement of 2 vines facing 2 vines and one sticking out like a tail, shtayim keneged shtayim, b'achas yitzizanav, as we mentioned in the 4th parak. So v'imalav einan mitzarfas. But if not, that is the 2 rows are less than 4 amas and more than 8 amas apart, they do not combine to form a vineyard. Rather, they are considered individual vines from which other plants need to be distanced only 6 tvachim. Gefen sheyavsha, if a grapevine has dried up and died, asura v'einan mikadeshes, it's forbidden to plant other seeds in the work area because people may think it's a live vine that has lost its leaves. The Torah does not prohibit planting near a dead vine. However, even a live vine loses its leaves in the fall, and at times even in the summer. The Rabbanan therefore answered planting near a dead vine throughout the year, since they are concerned that people might think this is a vine that is a live vine that has lost its leaves. Nevertheless, if other seed was planted here, it doesn't answer the other produce. If other seeds were planted in the work area of a dried out vine, the produce does not become aser, bahana, as Kilayim Perek. This is because the isser against planting is only midrabanan, not midiraisa, and the Rabbanan did not aser the produce that grew from such a mixture. So too with regard to the cotton plant, it's forbidden to plant other seeds in its work area, since the cotton plant is similar to a grapevine. However, it does not answer the produce of a seed that was planted there. The cotton plant resembles a grapevine. It's called Samar Geffen probably for a reason. If a person were to plant near a cotton plant, people may mistake the cotton plant for a grapevine and think that the person is planting within the work area of a grapevine. However, since the isser against planting is midrabanan and not deraisa, its produce is not going to be aser. Rabbi Eliezer bar Tzadik Omer Mishmai. Rabbi Eliezer bar Tzadik says in Rameir's name, Av al gabe hagefen also vein mekadosh. We learned in Mishnah Aleph that it's also to plant other seeds directly above the buried branch of a vine, because the roots of the plants will likely grow into the branch, a violation of the isser against grafting a plant onto a tree. The Mishnah concludes with the halacha that's related to that law. The afal gabe hagefen also vein mekadosh. So to above a grapevine, it's forbidden to plant other seeds, yet it does not prohibit the produce that grows afterwards. Unlike Kilayim Perek, whose produce is aser, the isser of grafting does not forbid the produce. The produce of grafting will not be aser b'hana. Mishnah Gimel. Elu oitzrin v'lei mekachin. In general, if a person plants grain or vegetables in a vineyard, both the grapes and the grain or vegetables are aser b'hana. In the previous Mishnah, a number of cases were mentioned where planting is aser, yet the produce is not aser b'hana. This Mishnah lists a number of additional cases where it's aser to plant grain or vegetables near vines, yet the produce is not considered aser b'hana, as well as some situations where it is going to be aser b'hana. So elu oitzrin v'lei mekachin. The situation in the following 4 areas forbids planting seeds of other species here, but does not aser the produce that grows here. Meiser choban hakarim, the additional area in the destroyed section of a vineyard. In each of the cases that the Mishnah will mention, there are 2 distinct prohibited areas. One area where planting is prohibited and the produce is prohibited for benefit, and another additional area where planting is also prohibited, yet the produce is not considered aser b'hana. The first case, the destroyed section of the vineyard, is a clearing in the vineyard, the karachas hakarim discussed in Parak Dalet. We learned here that according to Beis Hillel, a clearing in a vineyard may not be planted with other species if the clearing measures less than 16 amos across. Our Mishnah now teaches that although planting in such a clearing is aser, it does not necessarily result in the produce becoming forbidden for use. Only planting within 4 amos of the surrounding vines will cause the produce to become prohibited. However, planting in the additional area of the clearing, that is in the parts of the clearing that are more than 4 amos from the surrounding vines, does not cause the produce to become aser. For example, if the clearing in the middle of the vineyard measures 15 amos, and the other seeds were planted in the middle 7 amos of the clearing, the produce doesn't become aser, since the plants are outside the 4 amos work area of the surrounding vineyard. Meiser mechal hakarim, the additional area in the perimeter, the outer edge of a vineyard. We also learned in Parak Dalet that a person may not plant other species inside the perimeter of a vineyard. That is the space between the edge of a vineyard and its surrounding wall. If that space is less than 12 amos wide, our Mishnah now teaches that in that case as well, only planting within 4 amos of the vineyard's work area will cause the produce to become prohibited. Planting in the remaining space, the perimeter's additional area that lies beyond the 4 amos of the vineyard, does not cause the produce to become prohibited. For example, if the space between the edge of a vineyard and the surrounding wall was 11 amos, and other seeds were planted in the 7 amos closest to the wall, the produce will not become prohibited, since the seeds were planted beyond the 4 amos work area of the vineyard. Meiser piskei aris, the additional area in the gaps of an aris. An aris is a group of at least 5 vines that are trained, directed to grow on a wall or the like. Even if there's only one row of vines, this is considered a vineyard, and the seeds of other species may not be planted within 4 amas of those vines. We also learned in the previous parak, in Mishnah Vav, we're a case of an oris that contained 11 vines, and the middle vine was removed. This creates a gap in the row of vines. 5 vines on each side of the gap, with each group of 5 vines being an oris in its own right. If the gap measures at least 8 amas plus 1 tefach, planting is permitted there, as long as the plants are a distance of 4 amas from each group of vines. Our Mishnah comes to teach that if the gap is smaller than that, in which case planting is aser, the produce will be mutter for use if the plants are in the additional area, the moiser machel hakarim, or the moiser piskei oris. That is the area that is more than 6 tachim from the nearest vine. The same certainly holds true if a different species was planted more than 6 tachim from a single oris, that is from a row of such vines from which none were removed. Moiser afif yaris, and the additional area beneath the latticework roof that supports a grapevine. We learned in Perek Vav of Mishnah Gimel that if a person trains the grapevine on the roof of a structure, he may not plant seed of other species even beneath the section of the roof where the vine is not growing at this time. Our Mishnah teaches that although planting under this additional area of the structure is forbidden, whatever grows there does not become asur b'hana. Avol tachas hagefen. In certain other areas, however, not only is it asur to plant other species, but the produce of that planting also becomes asur b'hana. Avol tachas hagefen, the area beneath the grapevine. The speaking of the area under the branch of a grapevine which extends beyond the work area that surrounds the vine's trunk, it's also to plant other species in the area beneath such a branch. Va'avodas hagefen, and the 6 tachim work area of a single grapevine. Va'arba amash habakarim, and the 4 amma work area of a vineyard. Harei elu mekatros. These do prohibit the produce and will make them aser. Mishnah Dalet. Hamasachech es gefanoi al gabe tvasi shel chaveroi. As mentioned in the previous Mishnah, if the seeds of another min are planted beneath the grapevine, the produce becomes aser. Our Mishnah discusses halacha of a person who spread a grapevine over another person's grain. If someone spreads his grapevine over his fellow's grain, he causes the grain that grows to become aser es kilei hakarim. The grapes which belong to the person who created the kilayim obviously become aser as well. Moreover, the person who spread the vine is responsible to pay for the grain since he had caused a loss to his fellow. Rabbi Yossi and Reb Shimon say a person cannot cause that which is not his to become aser. Since the grain does not belong to the person who spread the grapevine, it does not become aser as kilei hakarim. The Torah says that you should not sow your vineyard kilayim. This term "your" excludes someone else's vineyard. Like Sizra karmecho kilayim, the mashma karmecho v'lekarm acher. The pasuk says you should not plant your field kilayim. That's mashma that dafka your karim and not someone else's karim. Rabbanan amri letizra karmecho. The pasuk says letizra karmecho ainli ela karmecho karim acher minayin. How do you know that a different karim that you plant can also become aser? Tamalema kilayim kamakar. Regardless of who it belongs to. And it's not a question of bailus over here. It's not a question of who owns it, but it's a question of was there kilayim here or not. Mishnah Hey. Reb Yossi ma'isa be'echos shazoras karma b'shvius u'ba ma'isa l'fnei Reb Akiva v'omar ein od makadosh dover sheinu shaloi. Reb Yossi brings support to his position in the previous Mishnah that a person cannot cause something that is not his to become aser. Reb Yossi said, ma'isa be'echos shazoras karma b'shvius. It once happened that someone planted a seed of another species in his vineyard during Shemitah. Every 7th year is Shemitah, and all produce is considered hefker and may be taken by it all. Therefore, the produce is not considered the produce of the owner of the field. The Mishnah's case is therefore similar to the case discussed by Rabbi Yossi and Reb Shimon in the previous Mishnah, where someone planted his grapes in his neighbor's field of grain, because here it doesn't belong to anybody. And reported the incident came before Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said a person cannot cause something that's not his to become aser, therefore the produce is not aser. So this is the same as that of Rabbi Yossi and Reb Shimon in the previous Mishnah, so Rabbi Akiva would agree to that. Mishnah Vav. The previous Mishnayos discussed the halacha that a person cannot aser something that's not his. This Mishnah discusses another case of a person who created a possible situation of kilayim in another person's property. If a robber planted seeds in a vineyard that he stole from its owner, and the vineyard then left the robber's possession, that is, was returned to the owner with the produce now growing in it, the owner harvests the produce even during Chol HaMoed. Many types of malacha, including harvesting, are generally also during Chol HaMoed. Here, however, it's mutter to harvest the produce on Chol HaMoed so it should not appear as if he's being mekayim kilayim. As a general rule, land cannot be removed from the possession of its original owner, and halachically remains the owner's property even after it was stolen, as opposed to mentaltalin, which under certain circumstances will be considered property of the robber if he makes a kinyan on it, requiring him return only the value of the stolen object rather than the object itself. Therefore, based on the halacha that a person cannot asher something that's not his, the ganav does not create climb, the anos does not create climb in the vineyard. Nevertheless, since the vineyard appears to have climb in it, the produce must be removed as quickly as possible. Ad kamahu naisin lapa'alim. In order to remove the produce quickly, the owner is required to hire workers to help him speed up the removal. The Mishnah discusses how much he's obligated to spend on workers. Up to how much extra must the owner pay workers in order to quickly remove the climb? Ad shlish, up to an additional 1/3 above what it normally costs. That is, up to 1/3 more than the amount that workers generally charge. For example, if the going rate for workers is 3 zuz a day, and the owner cannot find workers for less than 4 zuz per day, he must pay that price. Yes, and he can. If he cannot find workers unless he pays more than this, for example, in the case given in the previous, as we explained previously, he can only find workers that cost more than 4 zuz per day. He harvested himself at his normal pace and continues until he completes the job. He's not required to pay for workers, even though this delays the removal of the climb until after the Yom Tov. If after the Yom Tov the owner will be able to find workers for the usual rate, or up to 1/3 more than their amount, he'll be mechuyev to hire them at that time as well. In the case being discussed, the vineyard is still considered in the rishos of the original bailam. Therefore, the produce is mutter based on the halacha that a person cannot asher something she'enu shaloi that's not his. If the vineyard remains in the possession of the robber, the anos, however, it can eventually have the status of the property of the anos, and his actions will asher the produce. So anos, for when is the vineyard called the property of the robber, said its produce is prohibited by the climb he plants, mishiyishka, when the identity of the original owner is forgotten. That means that when people no longer call it the owner's vineyard, instead refer to it as belonging to the robber. At this point, the field is considered as if it's the robber's field, and by planting or allowing climb to grow there, the produce becomes asur. Mishnah Zayin. Haruach she'ilalo es hagfanim al gabe hatvua. We learned in Mishnah Gimel that a grapevine hanging over grain creates kilei akarim. The Mishnah returns to discuss further halachas involving grain that's underneath the grapevine. If the wind blew grapevines over a grain that was growing, the grain and the grapevines were planted at the required distance from each other, and later the wind came and blew the vines above the grain, yigdar miyad, the owner must immediately cut the vines that are no longer over the grain. If they are allowed to remain there, both the vines and the grain will become asur b'hana. Here the Mishnah is speaking of a case where the vines were cracked or twisted in a manner that simply turning them back is not enough. Im eri oinus, if as a result of circumstances that were beyond his control, he could not cut the vines, for example, his close relative died, in which case he may not work during the 7-day period of mourning, or the workers he hired to remove the vines did not come as promised, mutter, they are mutter b'hana, since the owner did not willingly allow them to stay there, the produce does not become asur. Regarding a person's grain that was leaning beneath a vine, the grain was planted the required distance from the vine and not directly beneath any of its branches. However, as the grain grew, it bent over, so that part of the grain is now beneath the branches of the vine. And similarly, regarding greens, vegetables that are leaning beneath the vine, the owner must turn the grain or greens back, away from beneath the vine. However, if they are not turned back, the vine does not make the grain or greens asur b'hana. Although we learned in Mishnah Gimel that other minim that are growing beneath a grapevine do become asur, that's when the actual plant is growing under the vine. Here, however, the trunk or stalk of grain or vegetable is not beneath the vine, only the upper part of the grain or vegetable is leaning under the vine. For this reason, the halacha here is different from the first case of our Mishnah, where we learned that if the vines were allowed to remain in position over the grain, the vines and the grain do become prohibited for benefits, they do become asur b'hana. In that case, the vines are positioned over the main part of the grain, while here they are not. The Mishnah turns to address how developed grain and grapes must be in order to become asur as kilei hakarim. For when in its development can grain become prohibited for benefit as the climb of the vineyard? Mishatashrish, when the grain takes root, va'anavim, and when can grapes become prohibited for benefit? Mishayasik apal halavan, when they become the size of a white bean. If a person plants grain in a vineyard, neither the grain nor the grapes become asur b'hana, until the grain takes root and the grapes grow the size of a poil halavan. Similarly, if a person planted grain in an existing vineyard whose grapes have not yet reached the size of a white bean, neither the grain nor the grapes become asur b'hana until the grape grows to that size. If the grain is uprooted before the grapes reach that size, the grapes do not become prohibited. Thus, minatera, neither the grapes nor the grain become asr unless both have reached a critical stage. Nevertheless, midrabanan, the grain becomes asr when it takes root, even if the grapes are not yet the size of a pala lavan. Tvua sheyavsha kol tarka, grain that is ripened fully and dried to its full extent, va'anavim shebishlu kol tarkon, and grapes that are ripened to their full extent, and miskachos, they do not become asr. Therefore, if a person plants grain in a vineyard whose grapes have already fully developed, or a vine among grain that is completely ripe, neither the grain nor the grapes become asr bahana. Here too, neither the grapes nor the grain has become asr unless both of them have not yet fully ripened. Mishnah Ches Ovtetz Nokuf. A flower pot with a hole in it, which is large enough for small roots to fit through, can draw nourishment from the ground, even though it's not actually connected to the ground. The Mishnah discusses grain that was planted in a flower pot that had been placed in a vineyard or within its 4 amma work area. So Ovtetz Nokuf Makach Bekarim. If a flower pot with a hole in it was placed in a vineyard and grain was then planted in it, it asers bahano, both the grain and the flower pot and the grapes in the vineyard. However, if grain was planted in a flower pot that does not have a hole in it, does not after the grain of the flower pot or the grapes in the vineyard. A flower pot that does not have a hole in it is not considered connected to the ground beneath it. Therefore, when a person plants grain in it, the grain is not seen as being planted in the ground. Thus, it is not considered Kilayim of the karam. Midrabanan, one may not plant grain even in such a flower pot. However, if one was over on this iser, the grain remains mutter bahano. Reb Shimon, however, Reb Shimon says zev is a iser lemekachin, planted in both a flower pot with a hole and one without a hole is asr. Nevertheless, it does not make the grain or grapes asr bahano. Reb Shimon holds that a flower pot that has a hole in it has the same halacha as a flower pot that does not have a hole in it. In both cases, planting in a flower pot is not considered the same as planting in the ground. Hamavir otzitz nokov vakaram, regarding a person who brings a flower pot that has a hole in it, in which grain has taken root through a vineyard, which is passing under the vines. Im haisef v'masayim asr. The halacha is that if the grain increased by 1/200th while in the vineyard, the grain is asr. A foreign species is not prohibited in the karam unless during the time that it's in the vineyard it increases in size and amounts at least 1/200th of its final size. Nevertheless, since the flower pot was only moved through the airspace and never rested on the ground, does not asr the grapes. In fact, for this reason, the grain too is not asr midiraisa. Nevertheless, the rabbanon asr passing through a vineyard with a flower pot with a hole in it, and if someone did, they prohibited the grains as a knas. But me'ikar adin, it's not asr.